The cathedral had turned into something between a crime scene and a circus. Police officers arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the shocked silence that had followed the opening of the casket. Detective Sarah Mitchell took control immediately, ordering everyone to stay put, though dozens of guests were already pushing toward the exits. Margaret sat in the front pew now, the leather journal still in her lap, watching Richard Ashford pace back and forth like a caged animal. His carefully constructed mask of grief had shattered completely. Now he was on his phone, barking orders at lawyers, threatening lawsuits, demanding that Margaret be arrested immediately for fraud, for theft, for anything they could charge her with. His face was red and twisted with rage. This was the Richard that Eleanor had lived with behind closed doors, the one Margaret had seen too many times over the years. Sarah approached Margaret with a notepad and kind eyes. She sat down beside her, speaking quietly despite the chaos around them. "Margaret, I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning. When did Eleanor first come to you?" Margaret took a deep breath. She had known this moment would come. She had prepared for it. But actually sitting there, about to expose years of secrets, still felt terrifying. "It was 3 months ago," Margaret began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Mrs. Eleanor came to my room above the garage late one night. I thought something terrible had happened because she was crying. She had papers in her hands, folders full of documents. She sat on my bed and told me she needed help. She said she was going to disappear and she needed someone she could trust," Sarah wrote quickly, glancing up occasionally to meet Margaret's eyes. "Did she tell you why she wanted to disappear?" Margaret nodded slowly. She was afraid. She had been afraid for years, but it got worse. She found things, discovered things about Mr. Ashford's business, illegal things. But more than that, she was trapped. He controlled everything in her life, every dollar she spent, every person she talked to, everywhere she went. Richard stopped pacing when he heard this. He stormed over to where Margaret and Sarah sat. "This is insane!" he shouted, pointing at Margaret with a shaking finger. "This woman is lying. She's always been unstable." Eleanor was happy. She had everything she could want. This is some kind of sick fantasy. Sarah stood up, putting herself between Richard and Margaret. "Mr. Ashford, I'm going to need you to step back. If you interfere with this interview, I'll have you removed from the premises." Richard's lawyer arrived then, a thin man in an expensive suit who immediately started whispering urgently in Richard's ear. They moved away, but Richard kept staring at Margaret with pure hatred in his eyes. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, but continued talking. "Mrs. Eleanor showed me bank statements that proved Mr. Ashford was moving money through fake charities. She had emails showing he was bribing government officials. She had recordings of him threatening her, telling her what would happen if she ever tried to leave him." Sarah's expression grew more serious with each word. "Where are these documents now?" Margaret opened the journal and carefully removed a small key that had been taped inside the back cover. "Everything is in a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown. Mrs. Eleanor set it up in my name 6 months ago. She knew no one would think to look there. She said if anything happened to her or if the plan failed, I should give this key to the police." The detective took the key, examining it closely before placing it in an evidence bag. "Margaret, I need to ask you something important. Do you know where Eleanor is right now?" Margaret shook her head. "No, she said it was safer if I didn't know. That way no one could force me to tell. All I know is she left the country. She planned everything so carefully. She even had a new passport made with a different name. More police officers had arrived and were photographing the casket, taking statements from guests, securing evidence. The funeral director sat in a corner looking pale and confused, insisting he had no idea the body wasn't Eleanor Ashford. He explained that the casket had arrived already sealed from the crematorium, which was standard procedure. He had assumed everything was legitimate. Sarah made a phone call, stepping away briefly before returning to Margaret. "I'm sending officers to the bank now to secure that safety deposit box. Margaret, I need you to understand something. What you and Eleanor did, faking a death, it's serious. There could be legal consequences for you." Margaret had expected this. She nodded calmly. "I know. But Mrs. Eleanor said she had lawyers who could help me. She promised I would be protected." And even if I'm not, I would do it again. You didn't see what she went through. You didn't hear her crying at night. You didn't watch her become a shadow of herself. One of the funeral guests, an older woman dripping with jewelry, suddenly spoke up loudly. "I saw it," she said, standing from her pew. "I saw how Richard treated Eleanor. We all saw it, but nobody said anything. He belittled her at parties. He made decisions about her life without asking her. Last year at the charity gala, I watched him grip her arm so hard she winced. When I asked if she was okay, he laughed and said she was clumsy." Others began murmuring agreement. The facade was cracking. Richard's lawyer tried to silence people, but it was too late. Another voice joined in, then another. A business partner admitted he had always felt uncomfortable with how Richard spoke about his wife. A neighbor said Eleanor had seemed like a prisoner in her own home. Margaret watched as years of quiet observations tumbled out into the open. People had seen, but no one had helped. Everyone had looked away. Sarah interviewed several more witnesses while her team processed the scene. The mannequin parts from the casket were carefully removed and documented. Margaret watched as they lifted out pieces of weighted plastic and cloth, thinking about how desperate Eleanor must have been to plan something so elaborate. It must have taken incredible courage to arrange her own funeral, to let people believe she was dead, to walk away from everything she knew. Richard finally left with his lawyer, threatening everyone with lawsuits, promising he would find Eleanor and make her pay for this humiliation. As his car pulled away, Margaret felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Sarah sat back down beside her. "I need to know more about how Eleanor actually pulled this off. You said someone took her place in the casket. Who?" Margaret had been dreading this question. "A woman named Ruth. Mrs. Eleanor met her at a homeless shelter where she volunteered. Ruth was dying of cancer, had maybe 2 months to live, no family, no home. Mrs. Eleanor took care of her, paid for her to stay in a nice hospice, made sure she was comfortable. When Ruth died naturally 4 weeks ago, Mrs. Eleanor arranged for her body to be prepared. She looked similar enough to Mrs. Eleanor, same age, same build. With the right makeup and Mrs. Eleanor's jewelry in a sealed casket, it worked." Sarah's face showed a mix of shock and something like admiration. "That's incredibly calculated." Margaret shook her head. "It was survival. Mrs. Eleanor didn't want to hurt anyone. She made sure Ruth was cared for in her final days. She gave that woman dignity and comfort when she had nothing, and Ruth agreed to help. She told Mrs. Eleanor it would be nice to matter, to help someone, even after she was gone." The detective asked more questions about timelines, about how Eleanor had changed her appearance, about the passport and travel arrangements. Margaret answered what she could, but Eleanor had been careful not to share too many details. The less Margaret knew, the safer she would be. That had been Eleanor's reasoning, and now Margaret understood why. As the afternoon wore on and the cathedral finally began to empty, Margaret thought about the moment 3 months ago when Eleanor had sat on her bed crying. She remembered Eleanor's hands shaking as she showed Margaret the documents, the fear in her eyes, but also the determination. "I can't live like this anymore," Eleanor had whispered. "I won't. Either I find a way out or I'll die trying. Will you help me, Margaret?" "You're the only person I trust." Margaret had said yes without hesitation, not because of loyalty or years of service, but because she recognized something in Eleanor's eyes that night. It was the same look Margaret had seen in her own mirror years ago when her husband had died and left her with nothing. It was the look of someone who had finally decided they deserved better. It was the look of someone choosing themselves for the first time. Sarah finished her notes and closed her notebook. "You'll need to come to the station tomorrow to make a formal statement. And Margaret, you should probably get a lawyer. This situation is complicated." Margaret nodded. She was tired, more tired than she had ever been, but also strangely peaceful. She had spent 37 years being invisible, and today she had become the most visible person in the room. Tomorrow there would be consequences. Tomorrow there would be questions and complications and possibly charges. But tonight, somewhere in the world, Eleanor Ashford was breathing free air for the first time in years, and that made everything worth it. The morning air was cold and heavy with the smell of expensive flowers when Margaret Chen arrived at St. Catherine's Cathedral. She had been awake since 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, knowing what she was about to do. Her hands shook as she buttoned her best black dress, the same one she had worn to her own husband's funeral 15 years ago. Today would be different, though. Today she would stop a funeral instead of attending one. Margaret stood near the back entrance of the cathedral, watching as black cars pulled up one after another. Rich people stepped out in their designer clothes and dark sunglasses, whispering to each other about the tragedy of losing Eleanor Ashford so suddenly. Margaret knew better. She clutched the brown leather journal against her chest, feeling its weight like it held the truth of the entire world inside it. 37 years she had worked for the Ashford family, cleaning their homes, cooking their meals, listening to their secrets. 37 years of being invisible, of being just the help, of watching everything while people pretended she saw nothing. The cathedral filled quickly with hundreds of people. Margaret recognized some of them from the mansion. Business partners who came for dinner parties, society women who played cards with Eleanor on Thursday afternoons, politicians who smiled for cameras while making deals in Richard Ashford's private study. They all looked sad, but Margaret wondered how many of them actually cared. How many of them knew the real Eleanor, the woman who cried in her bedroom when she thought no one could hear, the woman who stared out windows like a prisoner dreaming of freedom. Richard Ashford arrived last, as important men always do. His car was the longest, the blackest, the most expensive. He stepped out wearing a suit that probably cost more than Margaret earned in 6 months. His face looked tired and sad, exactly how a grieving husband should look. Margaret felt anger rise in her throat. She had seen his other faces, the cruel ones, the controlling ones, the faces he showed Eleanor when no one else was watching. Today he played the heartbroken widower perfectly, accepting condolences, shaking hands, letting people pat his shoulder and tell him how sorry they were for his loss. The funeral began with organ music that made the cathedral feel even colder. Margaret moved closer to the front, sliding between pews, using her small frame to stay unnoticed. People were used to not noticing her anyway. The priest spoke about Eleanor in words that sounded pretty but empty, talking about a woman he barely knew. He said Eleanor was devoted, charitable, graceful, beloved. Margaret wanted to shout that Eleanor was also trapped, afraid, desperate, and brave enough to do something impossible. The casket sat at the front covered in white roses, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Richard had ordered the most expensive funeral money could buy. White roses had been Eleanor's favorite, but Margaret knew the truth now. The casket was a lie. The funeral was a lie. The whole thing was theater, and she was about to pull back the curtain. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she thought people might hear it. She had practiced what she would say 100 times, but now her mouth felt dry. She thought about turning around, about staying quiet like she had stayed quiet for 37 years. Then she remembered Eleanor's face 3 months ago when she came to Margaret's small room above the garage. Eleanor had been crying, holding papers, looking more scared than Margaret had ever seen her. That night changed everything. The priest raised his hands to give the final blessing. This was the moment. If Margaret waited any longer, they would close the casket, carry it out, bury it, and the truth would stay buried with it. She thought about her own children, grown now with families of their own. She thought about her granddaughter who asked her once why she never stood up for herself. She thought about all the years of being invisible, voiceless, powerless. Margaret's voice came out stronger than she expected. "Stop!" she said, then louder. "Stop this funeral right now!" The organ music cut off. Heads turned. Hundreds of eyes found her. The priest froze with his hands still raised. Margaret stepped into the center aisle, holding the journal up where everyone could see it. "Please, you have to stop this. Mrs. Eleanor is not dead." The cathedral exploded with noise. People gasped, whispered, stood up to see better. Richard Ashford's face went from sad to shocked to furious in seconds. He pointed at Margaret and shouted for security. 2 large men in suits started moving toward her. Margaret knew she had maybe 30 seconds before they grabbed her and threw her out. 30 seconds to change everything. She opened the journal to the page marked with a faded blue ribbon. Her hands still shook, but her voice stayed steady. "Mrs. Eleanor Ashford is not in that casket," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. 3 months ago, she came to me with a plan. She was tired of living in fear. She was tired of being controlled like a prisoner in her own home. She wanted freedom, and she asked me to help her. I helped her. Security guards reached her, but stopped when the whole cathedral erupted again. People were shouting questions, standing on pews to see, pulling out phones. Richard pushed through the crowd toward Margaret. His face was red now, all pretense of grief gone. "You're insane!" he shouted at her. "Guards, remove this woman immediately. She's having some kind of breakdown. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Margaret did know. She knew exactly what she was saying and what it would cost her. She looked Richard Ashford in the eyes, this man she had served breakfast to for decades, and felt no fear. "I know exactly what I'm saying, Mr. Ashford. Your wife is alive. She planned her escape for over a year. She found someone to take her place. She documented everything you did to her. And she's gone somewhere. You can never find her." A woman in the crowd screamed. Others started pushing toward the casket. Richard grabbed Margaret's arm hard enough to hurt. "What have you done?" he hissed at her, his mask completely gone now. "What have you done, you stupid woman?" But before he could say more, a voice cut through the chaos. "Everyone step back. Step back now." Detective Sarah Mitchell pushed her way to the front. Margaret recognized her from family gatherings, some distant cousin of the Ashfords. Sarah was in a black dress like everyone else, but she moved with authority that made people listen. "Mr. Ashford, release her," Sarah said firmly. Richard let go of Margaret's arm. Sarah turned to the priest. "Open the casket!" The priest looked horrified. "Detective Mitchell, I can't possibly—" Sarah cut him off. "Open it now. If this woman is lying, we'll know immediately. If she's telling the truth, then we're standing at a crime scene." She pulled out her badge and phone. "Open the casket or I'll do it myself." Everything happened fast after that. The priest and funeral director opened the casket with shaking hands. People crowded forward. Margaret heard gasps and screams. Inside the casket, carefully arranged to pass a quick inspection, were mannequin parts weighted to feel like a body. Eleanor's jewelry was there, her wedding ring, her favorite scarf, items meant to make the casket feel like it held her. But Eleanor herself was gone. Richard Ashford staggered backward like someone had hit him. His face went white. Sarah Mitchell immediately started directing people, securing the scene, calling for backup. The cathedral descended into complete chaos. People were crying, shouting, trying to leave, trying to get closer. Cameras flashed. Margaret stood in the middle of it all, still holding the journal, feeling strangely calm. She had done it. After 37 years of being invisible, she had been seen. After 37 years of staying quiet, she had spoken. And nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret squeezed Eleanor's hand. "I have everything I need. This cottage, this new life, it's more than I ever dreamed of. But more than that, I have peace knowing you're safe. That's what mattered most to me." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. "You gave me my life back, Margaret. I was dying in that mansion, slowly suffocating, losing myself piece by piece. You were brave enough to help me when no one else would." They spent the whole day together, walking on the beach near Margaret's cottage, talking about everything and nothing, making up for lost time. As the sun started to set, Eleanor prepared to leave. She had to return to her new life, to stay safe and hidden. They hugged goodbye at Margaret's door, both knowing it might be a long time before they could meet again. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, "for everything, for seeing me, for believing me, for saving me." Margaret watched Eleanor drive away, standing on her porch until the car disappeared around the bend. She went inside and sat in her favorite chair by the window, looking out at the darkening ocean. The leather journal sat on the table beside her, full of evidence and memories and the story of how one woman escaped and another woman helped her fly. Margaret thought about her granddaughter who had asked why she never stood up for herself. Now she had an answer. Sometimes standing up meant standing beside someone else, helping them find the courage to save themselves. Sometimes bravery looked like a quiet woman in a black dress stopping a funeral and telling the truth. Sometimes justice required breaking rules to protect someone who had no other way out. The cottage grew dark around her, but Margaret didn't turn on the lights yet. She sat in the peaceful silence, thinking about Eleanor painting in Portugal, about Richard facing his crimes, about how one moment of courage at a funeral had changed everything. She thought about 37 years of being invisible and one day of being impossible to ignore. She thought about freedom and its price, and whether anything mattered more than helping someone escape a cage. Outside, the waves crashed against the rocks in their endless rhythm. Inside, Margaret smiled to herself, content and proud and finally at peace. She had spent most of her life serving others, but in the end, she had served something more important than any employer. She had served justice, compassion, and the fierce belief that everyone deserved freedom. And that, Margaret knew, was worth everything. 6 months passed like water flowing downstream, carrying away the old life and bringing something completely new. Margaret stood on the porch of a small cottage in coastal Maine, watching seagulls circle above the gray-blue ocean. The cottage was simple but beautiful, with white walls and blue shutters, a garden full of roses that reminded her of Eleanor, and windows that looked out over the rocky beach. Eleanor had bought it for her, a gift tucked into the trust fund that had made Margaret financially secure for the rest of her life. The media attention had finally died down, though Margaret's face was still recognized occasionally in grocery stores or at the post office. Some people wanted to shake her hand and tell her she was brave. Others whispered and pointed, calling her a criminal who had helped someone break the law. Margaret didn't pay much attention to either group anymore. She had learned that doing the right thing didn't always make you popular, and she had made peace with that. Eleanor's interview aired on a Tuesday evening in early spring. Margaret watched it alone in her cottage, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands as Eleanor's face filled the television screen. Eleanor looked different, healthier somehow, with color in her cheeks and light in her eyes that Margaret hadn't seen in years. She sat in a chair with bright windows behind her showing mountains and blue sky, somewhere warm and far away from the cold mansion where she had lived like a prisoner. The interviewer was a respected journalist named Maria Santos, who had built her career on telling stories of women, overcoming impossible situations. She spoke to Eleanor with respect and genuine curiosity. "Eleanor, thank you for agreeing to speak with us. Can you tell us why you felt faking your own death was your only option?" Eleanor's voice was steady and clear. "I was trapped in a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, but was a prison on the inside. My husband controlled every aspect of my life. Where I went, who I spoke to, what I wore, what I thought. When I discovered his illegal activities and tried to confront him, he made it clear that if I ever tried to leave or expose him, I would regret it. I believed him. I had seen what he did to people who crossed him." Maria leaned forward slightly. "Why not just divorce him? Why go to such extremes?" Eleanor's expression grew sad. "You have to understand who Richard Ashford is. He's a billionaire with connections to politicians, judges, police chiefs, media executives. If I had filed for divorce, he would have buried me in legal proceedings for years. He would have used his influence to paint me as mentally unstable. He told me once that if I ever tried to take anything from him or embarrass him publicly, he had ways of making people disappear. I didn't think he meant kill me, but I knew he could destroy my life completely." Margaret watched Eleanor describe the planning that had gone into her escape. The months of gathering evidence, the careful documentation of Richard's crimes, the preparation for a new identity. Eleanor spoke about meeting Ruth at the homeless shelter, about how that dying woman had given Eleanor the final piece of her escape plan. "Ruth was remarkable," Eleanor said, her eyes shining with tears. "She had nothing, she was dying, she was alone, but she wanted her life to mean something. When I explained my situation and asked if she would consider helping me after she passed, she said yes immediately. She said if her death could give someone else life, that would be beautiful. I made sure her final weeks were comfortable and full of dignity. It was the least I could do." The interviewer asked about Margaret, and Eleanor's face softened with obvious affection. "Margaret Chen is the bravest person I know. She risked everything to help me. She had worked for my family for 37 years, and in all that time, she was the only person who truly saw me. She saw my pain, my fear, my desperation. When I asked for her help, she could have said no. She could have gone to Richard. She could have stayed safe. Instead, she chose to help me escape, knowing she might face legal consequences. I will spend the rest of my life grateful to her." The interview covered the funeral, the revelation, the aftermath. Eleanor explained that she had set up the dramatic exposure at the funeral deliberately. I needed proof that I was alive and safe before Richard could use his connections to spin the narrative. If I had just disappeared quietly, he could have reported me missing, used his influence to control the investigation, perhaps even claimed I had been kidnapped or killed. By staging the funeral revelation, by having Margaret present the truth publicly with evidence, I took control of my own story. Maria asked the question everyone wanted answered. Do you have any regrets about how you escaped? Eleanor thought for a moment before responding. I regret that it came to this. I regret that I had to fake my death to be free. I regret the pain it caused people who cared about me, though I made sure my family knew the truth before the funeral. But do I regret escaping? No, not for a single second. I'm alive now in a way I haven't been for 15 years. I make my own choices. I control my own money. I go where I want, speak to whom I want, think what I want. These are basic human rights that I didn't have before. Freedom is worth any price. Richard Ashford watched the interview from a much smaller apartment than the mansion he used to own. His assets were still frozen, his bank accounts inaccessible while multiple investigations continued. He had been forced to sell properties to pay his lawyers. His social circle had evaporated. Former friends wouldn't return his calls. Business partners had severed all connections. His name, once synonymous with success and power, was now associated with corruption and abuse. He sat in the dark watching his wife, his escaped wife, speak calmly about his crimes to millions of viewers. His lawyers had advised him not to watch, but he couldn't help himself. Part of him still couldn't believe Eleanor had outmaneuvered him so completely. She had always seemed so weak, so compliant, so easy to control. He had underestimated her, and it had cost him everything. The criminal charges against Richard moved slowly through the legal system. His lawyers were skilled at delays and procedural maneuvers, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial experts had traced the money laundering through his fake charities. Federal investigators had confirmed the bribery allegations. Business associates had started cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for lighter sentences. Richard's conviction seemed inevitable, though it might take years to finalize. Margaret received letters from around the world after Eleanor's interview. Women who had escaped abusive relationships wrote to thank her for helping Eleanor. Domestic violence organizations invited her to speak at events. A publisher offered her money to write a book about her experience. Margaret politely declined most requests. She had never wanted to be famous or celebrated. She had simply helped someone who needed help. One letter stood out from all the others. It arrived 3 weeks after the interview with a return address in Maine. Margaret opened it curiously and found an invitation to lunch at a small cafe in the nearest town. The invitation was signed by someone named Elizabeth Morrison. Margaret almost threw it away, assuming it was another journalist or curiosity seeker, but something made her look closer at the handwriting. It was familiar, elegant, with the distinctive way the letter E curved at the bottom. Margaret's heart started racing. She went to the cafe on a sunny Saturday morning, nervous and excited. She sat at a corner table with her back to the wall, watching the door. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Margaret started to think maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe it was just someone with similar handwriting. Then the door opened and a woman walked in wearing sunglasses and a simple blue dress. She had shorter hair now, darker than before, but Margaret would have recognized Eleanor Ashford anywhere. Eleanor saw Margaret and smiled, a real smile full of joy and relief. She crossed the cafe quickly and pulled Margaret into a tight hug. Both women were crying, holding each other like they were the only two people in the world. They sat down and held hands across the table, not caring who saw or what anyone thought. "I couldn't stay away," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "I needed to see you, to thank you properly, to make sure you're okay." They talked for hours, ordering coffee and breakfast and then lunch, neither wanting to leave. Eleanor explained that she was living in Portugal under her new identity, that she had a small house near the ocean, and spent her days painting and reading and finally living. She looked younger than Margaret had ever seen her, free from the weight of fear and control. "I think about you constantly," Eleanor said, "wondering if you're happy, if you're safe, if you have everything you need." The investigation moved quickly once Detective Sarah Mitchell opened the safety deposit box. Inside were 3 thick folders containing years of carefully documented evidence against Richard Ashford. Bank statements showed millions of dollars flowing through charitable foundations that existed only on paper. Email printouts revealed conversations with corrupt city officials about construction permits and zoning changes. There were photographs of Richard meeting with known criminals in expensive restaurants. Most damning of all were the audio recordings Eleanor had made secretly over 2 years, capturing Richard's threats and psychological abuse. Margaret sat in an interview room at the police station the next morning, a public defender named James Chen sitting beside her. James had kind eyes and spoke to her like she was a person, not just a criminal. "They're not going to charge you," he told her quietly before the interview began. "Eleanor's lawyers have been in contact. They've provided documentation showing you were acting under duress, helping someone escape domestic abuse. The district attorney is more interested in Richard Ashford right now." Sarah entered the room with another detective, an older man named Robert Torres. They sat across from Margaret and started a recording device. Sarah's voice was professional but not unkind. "Margaret, we've reviewed the contents of the safety deposit box. What you and Eleanor documented is extensive. I need you to walk me through what you personally witnessed during your time working for the Ashford family." Margaret took a deep breath and began talking. She described the early years when Eleanor had seemed happy, newly married, excited about her life. Then slowly things changed. Richard started making all the decisions. He chose what Eleanor wore to events. He approved or disapproved her friendships. He monitored her phone calls. Margaret remembered the day Richard fired Eleanor's personal assistant because he thought the woman was giving Eleanor too much independence. He told Eleanor she didn't need help, that having staff made her look spoiled and lazy. "He isolated her," Margaret explained, her hands folded on the table. "Year by year, person by person, he cut her off from everyone who cared about her. Her college friends stopped being invited to the house. Her sister was told she wasn't welcome anymore after she questioned Richard's treatment of Eleanor. Even Eleanor's own mother was only allowed to visit once a month, and Richard always made sure he was present during those visits." Detective Torres leaned forward. "Did you ever witness physical violence?" Margaret shook her head. "Not hitting, no. But physical control, yes. I saw him grab her arms hard enough to leave bruises. I saw him block doorways so she couldn't leave rooms during arguments. Once I found her locked in her bedroom from the outside. When I asked Mr. Ashford about it, he said Eleanor was having one of her episodes and needed to calm down. But there was nothing wrong with Mrs. Eleanor. She was just trying to have her own thoughts." Sarah showed Margaret printouts of bank statements. Eleanor documented that Richard controlled all finances. "Can you verify that?" Margaret nodded immediately. Mrs. Eleanor had credit cards, but Mr. Ashford received alerts every time she used them. He would question every purchase. If she bought something he didn't approve of, he would return it himself. She once bought a book he didn't like, and he threw it away. He said she was wasting his money on garbage. His money, always his money, even though Mrs. Eleanor came from a wealthy family herself. The interview continued for 3 hours. Margaret described incidents she had witnessed, conversations she had overheard, the gradual deterioration of Eleanor's spirit. She explained how Eleanor had started planning her escape after discovering Richard's illegal business activities. Eleanor had realized that if she tried to divorce him or report him to authorities, he would use his power and connections to destroy her. He had told her as much during one of their arguments that Margaret had accidentally overheard. "She was scared," Margaret said, her voice cracking slightly. "Not just scared like you worry about things. Scared like an animal in a trap. She told me she had nightmares about what Richard would do if she tried to leave. She said he had once told her that if she ever embarrassed him or tried to take what was his, she would regret being born. Those were his exact words." Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Ashford sat in his lawyer's office surrounded by a team of attorneys. They were preparing his defense, crafting narratives, finding ways to spin the situation. Richard insisted Eleanor had stolen from him, that she was mentally unstable, that Margaret had manipulated her. His lawyers were less confident. The evidence Eleanor had gathered was extensive and damning. The audio recordings alone were devastating, showing Richard's controlling behavior and implied threats. One of the lawyers, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance, spoke bluntly. "Richard, we have a serious problem. The recordings show a pattern of psychological abuse. The financial documents suggest money laundering at minimum, possibly fraud and bribery. Your best option right now is to cooperate fully, show remorse, and hope for a plea deal." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "I will not plead guilty to anything. Eleanor is a liar and a thief. I want her found and I want her prosecuted." Patricia exchanged glances with her colleagues. "Richard, Eleanor has been very strategic. She's currently beyond our jurisdiction. Even if we locate her, extradition will be nearly impossible given the abuse allegations. And frankly, public opinion is not on your side. The media is portraying you as a controlling billionaire and Eleanor as a victim who had no choice but to fake her death to escape." The media coverage was indeed intense. News outlets everywhere ran stories about the funeral that wasn't, the billionaire's wife who escaped, the loyal servant who helped her. Margaret found herself at the center of a media storm. Reporters camped outside her small apartment. She received interview requests from every major network. Most surprisingly, she received thousands of messages of support from people around the world who saw her as brave for helping Eleanor. The public reaction divided sharply along predictable lines. Many people, especially women who had experienced controlling relationships, celebrated Eleanor's escape and praised Margaret's courage. They organized fundraisers to help with Margaret's legal expenses, though it turned out she didn't need them. Eleanor's lawyers were handling everything. Other people, mostly those in Richard's social circle, condemned Eleanor and Margaret as criminals who had perpetrated an elaborate fraud. 2 weeks after the funeral, Sarah called Margaret with an update. They met at a quiet coffee shop away from reporters. Sarah looked tired but satisfied. "We've charged Richard Ashford with multiple counts of financial fraud, money laundering, and bribery. The domestic abuse charges are harder because Eleanor isn't here to testify, but the recordings help. His assets have been frozen pending investigation." Margaret stirred sugar into her coffee slowly. "What about Mrs. Eleanor? Will she be charged with anything?" Sarah shook her head. "The district attorney has decided not to pursue charges. Given the circumstances, the abuse, the fear for her safety, they're treating this as a case of extreme self-defense. Faking her death was unusual, yes, but it was her way of escaping a dangerous situation. The body she used was obtained legally. Ruth had given consent before she died. Eleanor broke some laws technically, but the DA doesn't think any jury would convict her." Margaret felt relief wash over her. She had worried constantly about Eleanor facing consequences. "Do you know where she is?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Officially, no. Unofficially, I know she's safe and she's happy. That's all I can say." Margaret understood. It was better not to know. Better that no one knew. Richard's empire continued to crumble as more information came out. Business partners distanced themselves. Boards forced him to resign from positions he had held for decades. Charitable organizations that had worked with his foundations launched their own investigations. Friends who had stood by him at the funeral now refused to take his calls. His reputation, built over 40 years, destroyed in 2 weeks. Margaret received a letter one morning with no return address and a Portuguese postmark. Inside was a single page in Eleanor's handwriting. "Dear Margaret, I don't have words to thank you for what you've done. You gave me my life back. I'm somewhere beautiful, somewhere warm, somewhere Richard will never find me. I wake up every morning and breathe free air. I make my own choices. I spend my own money. I talk to whoever I want. These simple things feel like miracles. The lawyers tell me you're safe and won't be charged. I've set up a trust fund in your name. You'll never have to work again unless you want to. You've earned your own freedom too. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for believing me when I was afraid. Thank you for risking everything to help me escape. I hope someday we can meet again, but for now, know that I'm alive and truly living for the first time in years. With love and eternal gratitude, E." Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears running down her face. She folded it carefully and placed it in the leather journal, next to the ribbon marking where everything had changed. That night she slept peacefully for the first time since the funeral, knowing that Eleanor was safe, that justice was happening, and that sometimes doing the right thing, no matter how risky or unconventional, was worth everything.